This is Learning Science Unpacked, a podcast mini-series from Sponge, dedicated to unpacking the science behind how we learn and behave. Over the next few sessions, I'll be digging deep into the science of learning with Professor Paul Howard-Jones, an educational neuroscientist at Bristol University. Together, we'll uncover the most effective strategies workplace learning professionals can use to optimise learning for performance, something we do at Sponge every day. Well, shall we start chatting about the future, Paul?
Yeah. Future is almost here.
I'm excited about this podcast today. It's the last in our series, but it's all about kind of taking a look forward into the future and taking a bit of a exploration around a few trends that we've identified that are happening kind of now and just casting our minds out to what might be the future of learning. Many people will be familiar with Neuralink, Elon Musk's company. They're designing brain-implanted devices that enhance our abilities. I'm sure you're aware of them, Paul, and I just wondered what's the kind of potential for this type of technology, and do you think that would become mainstream?
So what is the motivation for developing brain-computer interfaces? Well, ultimately, I guess the idea is that you're going to be able to control your computer. You don't need a keyboard. You can just think these things, and that can be very helpful. Now, there are some situations where these things are being developed and experimented with, such as when you're flying, a fighter aircraft, and you don't want to have to be pressing buttons at the same time. Is it possible for you to be able to send signals to fire missiles, something like that? I guess it's quite a consequence if you've got to make sure your brain-computer interface is totally 100%
working really well.
Yes, if you're going to do that sort of thing. But potentially, those sort of situations can be quite good applications for this.
I should say the current application is medical, so it is for people, of course, with sort of limited abilities. That makes sense.
Right.
But beyond that,
makes much more sense, doesn't it? Because if you've got very limited capabilities, then something which allows you to think between two options and choose them, that kind of makes sense to invest a lot of money and effort into that, because for those people, it could make all the difference in the world, because that could be their only communication channel they have available to them. But in the everyday world where we have our QWERTY keyboards, it's kind of difficult to, and also we have interfaces that can hear our speech and translate those into text, which I think is a massive thing. Now, the problem at the moment that we're facing with brain-computer interfaces, it is not so much receiving the signals from our brain, but actually knowing how to interpret them. So this relies on the level of development in terms of cognitive neuroscience, in terms of understanding those signals, analyzing them and understanding them. And a lot of that stuff is done offline. So even when we apply, a massive computer power stretched over a period of time with our data, we're still struggling to be able to identify clear signals, from a certain individual that corresponds to anything like a concept. We can get like a yes and a no, sure, and maybe after analysing, using artificial neural networks that have been trained on a particular sort of data set, we can go a little bit further than that. But this would need to operate in real time. So that's a completely different level of challenge. So I think it's going to be, the bottom line is I'm a little bit skeptical about whether brain-computer interfaces are going to be particularly useful to you and me in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I'm not holding my breath on that one.
Well, and the invasiveness, I suppose, kind of gives us the heebie-jeebies a little bit, doesn't it? I'm thinking of that Black Mirror where they put the little microchip on the back of his neck, and it's sort of, that's it. Putting something into our brains can feel frightening unless you have the choice.
No, but you don't need to do that. I mean, because you just put on an EEG hat. That's the sort of thing that they're experimenting with at the moment. I mean, yes, there are some advantages to actually implanting something surgically. But even then, trying to translate those messages from the brain into something which could, be meaningful, reliably meaningful, on a second by second basis is a massive challenge, I think.
Well, let's pick that up. You've mentioned putting things on, so that in the non-invasive devices, we've got some sort of tools like that focus headset, for example, that's supposed to make, if you're a gamer, supposed to kind of help increase your attention and focus your mind. What's going on with those kinds of devices? How do they work, and what's the potential for that kind of technology?
Well, I'd say that we have a hand-waving explanation of what's going on.
Okay.
So I can wave my hands around, give you an explanation. Essentially, neurons communicate with each other electrically. So, you're talking about, mechanisms operating within an electric field and generating an electric field. And so it's possible to influence those mechanisms by changing the electrical field. You're putting something into the mix, which is actually the medium in which the brain is operating. A very extreme example of this with transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you can actually put an electromagnet on a particular part of the brain and disrupt it so much that it's not operating anymore. So if you put one on here, I suddenly would be unable to talk.
Wow! If you take it off again, is it permanent? That damage?
No, it's just it's completely temporary.
Have you tried that?
I haven't actually. I imagine it.
Are you scared that it would?
To people who have tried it,
I would be terrified. I wouldn't come back again.
Really weird. Apparently, it's a very, very strange experience.
Wow!
You go to speak and you can't speak. Yeah.
Oh my gosh!
And an example of that was I can't remember which one. I think it was the angular gyrus they put it on, but there was a particular region in the brain. It's either that or the left inferior frontal gyrus. I can't remember one or the other. But they put it on the brain and showed that it was able. So they were looking at people who appeared to, or convinced that they were able to communicate directly with God. Which is culturally acceptable. It's not necessarily psychosis. But what was interesting was that when they put the transcranial magnetic stimulation on that brain region, actually the hotline to God broke.
Shut down.
It went down. So it is interesting stuff. But we're not talking about disrupting and stopping brain processes. We're talking about enhancing them. And so what's been interesting is that they've found that, relatively low changes or electrical fields that you're putting across the brain that are presumably interacting with the brain's own electrical field can enhance particular cognitive functions depending on where you put the electrodes. And, this appears to work. And in fact, the American military have used it to train, members of the military before they go into high security situations. So, one of those places where you have to be watching out all the time for anomalies or people you don't recognize or things moving, and their training in terms of how to respond, the rate at which they learn increases considerably as a result of having trained when wearing one of these magic hats with the electrical field. And so, and this is all bona fide science. And now one of my colleagues is working with this to improve the mathematics learning of children who are struggling with their mathematics.
So children will be wearing these devices? Children
are wearing these devices in this research, yes. And it appears to be having a positive effect on their learning. Again, it's one of these things where there's significant ethical issues and questions about what education and learning is about, because we don't even fully understand how these things operate themselves. We could be looking at a zero-sum situation whereby if you believe that you generally speaking, from one moment to the next, your cognitive capacity doesn't change. So if you're increasing one cognitive capacity, perhaps you're diminishing another. This is one argument why we might need to be a little bit careful with this. But yes, I mean, the effects last after you've taken the hat off, because what's happened is it's increased your learning, during that period. But yeah, there's no agency involved though necessarily, and or at least the agency of the child is quite diminished because they're not applying their own will. They're not controlling this enhancement to their capacity. It's not like they're being taught new strategies on how to learn or how to understand something. There's no, added value in that sense. And they are learning more, but it's as a result, literally, of just putting on the magic hat.
So they're not learning to learn; they're just learning.
No, well, we don't know, but I imagine they're not learning to learn so effectively as if they were not wearing the magic hat and getting the same results.
But these are commercially available now. These hats.
Not the ones that are being used in research, I think. Those are much more targeted and carefully developed and designed. But there are ones that you can buy. They're sort of sexy shapes and the different colours, and they're quite popular with gamers because they're improving your, if they improve your cognitive function whilst you're gaming, you can get more points. Yeah, it is very strange.
Yeah, these are the questions. Well, what about, you mentioned EEG devices a minute ago, and so what about things that are more supporting our understanding of how we're learning and collecting data about how we're learning? I've kind of explored a little bit before about biofeedback and devices that can tell us what's kind of going on with heart rate and heart rate variability and skin conductance or something along those lines. We've got, I've got my watch on that's collecting data about me all the time. Wearables, what's the potential for using wearables to understand when we might be engaged with learning, and the opportunity to gather that data and kind of alter our course of action and improve and enhance that experience for people?
Yeah, I mean, I think our abilities there are improving all the time. I mean, the capacity of the technology is really developing, and there are devices that you can wear that are not overall hairnets, which actually have dry electrodes, so you don't have to put some gunky stuff on the electrodes to make contact, and they can produce signals that can be translated by algorithms into things that you and I can understand, like how relaxed you are or how much you're paying attention, and yeah, I mean, I think so two things. First of all, I think that opens up a whole new area for research, which is quite interesting because we can be wearing these things, and there is already research being done where people are wearing these things in everyday real world learning situations, so we can collect data that is more meaningful than you might get from somebody lying in a big magnet and an fMRI scan. But the other thing is that yes, it will get to a point, it has got to a point where we can begin to purchase these privately and use them as learning tools to understand how our brain operates. And I think we're very close to being able to do that. I mean, I'm saying very close because there are products that are already claiming that they do that, but I've yet to see some really good evaluations of them in that role of providing neurofeedback to a personal learner who's trying to learn more about how they operate and can improve their learning using that neurofeedback. But already there is research published using more sophisticated technology, which is less affordable, where you can see that neurofeedback, for example, has improved the ability of conservatoire musicians by a whole degree grade in their performance in their final exams.
So how did that work then? They were getting their own feedback, or
basically by using the machine to be able to enter a certain mind state where your alpha theta ratio, which are two different wavelengths of electrical field output from the top of your head, two different ranges of wavelength, And if you get that ratio correct, and you just have to enter that sort of, it's a type of sort of peripheral alertness would be the best way of putting it, whereby you are very alert, but you're not focused narrowly. You're actually alert in a much more peripheral manner. And that's a mode of thinking where you can just be more creative. So you're relaxed, but you're also able to think ahead and carefully and be thoughtful. And that's the mode in which you can produce the best musical performance, essentially. So what these students were encouraged to do was to just spend a certain period every day experimenting with this neurofeedback, finding that mental state, if you like, so that they could find it more easily when it actually came to performing. When I assume that they were not actually wearing the gear, but they just knew how to enter that state.
That's what I was wondering. And so the gear that you're talking about, what was that? What is that?
It is EEG.
Okay. Is it like one of those Muse kind of?
No. This is the more expensive stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. But the commercial products are getting much better. So, it is entirely conceivable that soon we'll start seeing that sort of research coming through using these more commercial available products.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about an experiment that I took part in, where we all wore a heart rate variability device in a classroom while we were being given kind of a lecture, and all of our data collectively was being analysed in real time. And at the end of the presentation, the neuroscientist was able to tell us at what points each of us were engaged. And I guess from a presenter's perspective, if you've got a kind of live feed of how engaged your audience are, you can sort of up your, razzmatazz to keep people's attention if they're sort of drifting away. I mean, I think probably natural presenters would do that anyway, but fascinating implications for kind of trainers.
Yes, because perhaps more accurately, you know which bits of your razzmatazz are actually impacting and which bits are not.
Yeah.
And I think if you've got several people in the room hooked up to these things, so that you're actually looking at what is converging, what you're actually looking at correlation between people, and you've got multiple signals doing that, then that's that can definitely be done now, and that could be quite helpful. And they've done similar sorts of things where they've had students working in groups, and they've been measuring skin conductivity and skin temperature, and looking at correlations within the group. And the groups that work better together and produce more output were the ones that were actually more correlated in terms of their physiological responses as well. So you could also use it to know which groups were actually getting on and which ones you needed to go over and have a little word with.
Brilliant.
But again, lots of ethical issues, aren't there? Because you're right. I mean, it's not invasive in the medical sense, but you've got a trainer who's definitely getting inside your body. So
I always used to joke when I was heading up innovation that as soon as we have an injection that we can inject all our knowledge, we won't need to worry about all this learning anyway, or the method that we're doing it. And it was a bit of a joke. And then I seem to remember finding something going on at MIT where people were experimenting with injections of something that could help your brain improve memory, or it was very distant research. And I thought, gosh, maybe there is something in that. And do you know anything about this? Will we ever get to a stage where we could inject knowledge or ingest knowledge? Can you think of anything?
I'm not sure that's a target which is going to be so meaningful in the future, because I don't actually think we're going to need as much knowledge in the future in that sense. But what's going to become much more important is knowing how to get the knowledge and what to do with it. So
access to knowledge rather than knowledge itself.
Yes, I mean that is happening already. So researcher Betsy Sparrow in the United States has done research on this and shown that we are already moving away from. We're getting worse at remembering knowledge, and much better at remembering where to find it. And that's what our instinctive reaction is now. It's, it's to reach for Google or whatever. And that's the world that we're living in. So in a way, our education and training needs to catch up with that world.
Where I wonder if this might kind of take us to is, we've been doing this kind of series for over 6 podcasts, and I'm kind of wondering if a new philosophy might be required for how we think about learning. And we've sort of touched on this a little bit, but at the heart of our kind of future learning experiences, I wonder whether education training needs to change. And one of the things I've really been struck by recently is Elon Musk set up an experimental school for his kids called Ad Astra, and then it changed into Astronova, and now I think it's the Synthesis School, and it's being run by someone else. But the kind of driving philosophy behind it is about helping kids to thrive in ambiguity. So kind of rather than following a traditional curriculum, the idea is that you practice problem solving and you work in collaborative teams, and it's really all about kind of judgment making, and it's just totally different to any other sort of school. And the view there is that this is going to kind of help kids to be better set up for the world that we live in today, with high levels of ambiguity and lots of real challenges that we're actually all going to need to kind of collectively figure out how to solve. And I wonder about that kind of applied to the workplace, and whether we are kind of even teaching and thinking in the right way. And perhaps it's a fundamental kind of shake up of the rug that needs to happen with sort of training and learning. And just thought I'd get your perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I think you are correct. There is something about our ideas about learning and education and training which seems to cause it to lag behind the zeitgeist, really. And I think that's possibly because it's so culturally, it's so important for passing on cultural consistency, if you like, and that's why you develop this inertia in terms of how we think about learning and training, because it's important. There's an important part of it which is about transmitting historical traditions all the time, but and that's okay up to a certain point, because actually it's about enculturation. It's about bringing people towards the midpoint of our culture to a large extent. But actually it falls down when things are moving so quickly and so rapidly, and you can kind of begin to see, the sorts of demands that you're going to have in the future, and you're having to. And then I think you have to say, let's do things differently. And I agree that one of the issues is moving away from knowledge and thinking about how we work with knowledge, how we access knowledge, and working at that sort of a level. I mean, how much do we learn from our phones, for example? I mean, I learn a massive amount from my phone. I have to say, but at the moment, there are still some sort of cultural barriers to using those sorts of devices. I think that it's not always seen as appropriate. I mean, I'm sure if you're in a training session and people are getting their phones out, you'd think, well, they're obviously not interested. But actually, those are quite often the people who are going to be trying to find out the knowledge and working out what's going on.
Yeah, and augmenting what maybe someone's telling them with something that they've had a question about and are just trying to find out.
But it's not culturally appropriate, is it, to some extent? There's still this sense in which you walk into a room and you're supposed to pay rapt attention to the person who is talking at you at the front.
Unless they tell you this is an activity that involves polling on your phone, and then you can kind of be involved in it. Yeah. I think there are some experiences that aren't in the training and learning sphere that shift that completely. And I'm thinking about more kind of immersive theatre and those kinds of immersive cinema, different types of activities that people can get involved in that become experiential and help, if you wanted to use that as a kind of learning experience, as a model for inventing and creating learning experience that was more engaging, you could look to those areas. But I think if we were going to take anything away from today about the future of where learning might go, could go, what would What would be your thoughts on that?
I mean, first of all, well, if you look, I always look backwards in order to look forward to some extent, because we only have history to guide us, don't we? We're not going to evolve in any very special way. Sometimes people think, oh, all right, we're getting more intelligent or whatever, but this doesn't appear to be the case. Actually, when you look at the data, this is a cultural phenomenon. So we're stuck essentially with the same biology that we had thousands of years ago. And that is still the foundation that we build on. That's still the substrate of our learning. And we really need to understand how that operates. You know, I'm talking about the brain, essentially. The technology is opening up opportunities at a much faster rate than we know what to do with them. That's my feeling. Because so often we get it wrong when we approach a new type of technology. And I think that, you know, in terms of trying to use it to enhance learning and education. I think one of the things that we can do now is to approach learning in a more scientific sense and introduce our understanding of the brain when it comes to any particular new learning opportunity, and ask ourselves, how is this going to engage, build, and consolidate? That really, it does come back to that. And that sounds, you know, it's maybe that's not the most exciting thing in the world, but it's actually really essential, and it's still the thing that's going to make the difference. And it's still a lot of work to be done there, because we have this fantastic, exciting ideas about how we learn now from neuroscience. And really, it's worth doing that translation work so that we are holding in our hands the principles of learning, because those principles, whatever the technology, those principles are still going to hold. Those are the things that provide the bedrock for us to be able to be flexible, for us to be able to embrace new learning opportunities, to know what to do with new technologies. Those things are still going to be the case, you know. And so let's take what we understand from neuroscience about how we learn and use that to inform how we approach these new opportunities.
Brilliant. You've taken us right full circle back to the beginning of the series with the EBC and how we learn, and I think just summed it up fantastically well. We're not going to change too much. We are likely to have the same hardware and biology, so let's get really good at learning to work with that. Brilliant, Paul. It's been so much of a pleasure to work with you on these podcasts this year, and I've learnt so much, and I really hope that everybody who watches them and listens to them will get the same benefits that I've had. And thank you enormously for your generosity and sharing all your knowledge. It's been brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. It's been a pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.